Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming to my 84th birthday party, and thank you also for the gifts and coming. And the first thing I'm going to do, you'll notice that I have two maps on the wall there and two maps on the wall there. They're both the same, and I'm going to give you copies of these maps and for you to look at during the third part of my talk. Okay, so for the moment you can just put them on the floor, and then I will tell you when to start looking at them.
Oh, I've got.
Pass them down.
I think I've got three.
Keep this one, pass this.
I got it.
Now, I would also like to say that the information you've had about me discussing my wonderful life is actually not quite correct. What I am going to be describing this evening is my experiences during World War II, which were, to be quite honest, quite hideous. And one of the reasons why they were so hideous was because of the place where I live, which is where you have the maps. So, the very first, there were three things that influenced my life, and my mother's life and my father's life during World War II. The very first one of them was the fact that during World War II, my father went to North Africa, Egypt, with the British 8th Army under the control of Lord Montgomery, and he used to spend all of his time driving between Cairo and about 1,200 miles along the coast of North Africa to where the Italians used to come over from Italy to North Africa, because the Italians were, of course, the allies of the Germans. So let me first of all start off by saying that I was born in 1936. Hitler declared war and said he wanted to conquer the world almost exactly the same day that I was born. And so his method of conquering the world was that first of all he was going to capture each one of the European countries, and then finally he would then invade England and take England. And so it took him very nearly 4 years to invade and capture the whole of Europe, and also large parts of Russia as well. And then in 1939 he then started his final assault on Poland, and it was when he started his final assault on Poland that England declared war on Germany. And so they knew that if he got Poland, then he would then be able to invade England. And even though England had the finest navy in the world, the force and the power of the German army was so intense that England decided they would have to fight them. And so the very first thing that influenced all of my life and my mother's life and my father's life during World War II was the fact that my father spent all of his time from 1939, when he volunteered to go back into the British 8th Army and then get stationed in Cairo, Egypt, was the fact that during the 1920s my father had been part of the Army of Occupation in India, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And England was a very, very strange country. We had this gigantic empire where we used to control everything. Africa, India, Pakistan, parts of China, and of course, to be quite honest, in a way, England even was the one that inhabited America first. And so England had all of this power, and yet at the same time, it also looked after a lot of its own welfare. And it also was a country, of course, that had a king and a queen and aristocrats. And yet, at the same time, England always looked after its working classes and so on. And this was because the king, the queen, and the nobility used to actually be a little bit scared of the working classes, and so they used to make sure they looked after them. So first of all, I'm going to show you some pictures of what my dad was up to in India, Pakistan and Afghanistan in the 1920s. Let me show you. This was my dear old dad during the 1920s. And as you all know, we have a great horse rider in our family by the name of Ashley Willems. And Ashley Willems gets her horse riding skills. They missed me, but my dad was an absolute brilliant horseman. And these are pictures of him riding horses in India, Pakistan and Afghanistan. When he was in India and Pakistan, of course, the members of the public always used to love being around the English invaders, and these were typical pictures that were taken that my dad took. And as you can see, there was the usual little kid hanging around, and the people from India, Pakistan and Afghanistan hanging around the English troops. This is yet another picture of my father taken in India, Afghanistan or Pakistan. As you can see, he was young, slim and very good looking, and also I suspect that they were fellow soldiers that were with him. And on this side we have a little Indian, Pakistani or Afghanistani kid hanging around the troops, you know, giving the salute and so on. And usually the troops were very good to them. And these were other members of my father's fighting unit. And during the war, the army's occupation of India, Pakistan and Afghanistan, one of the things my father got interested in was breeding dogs. And these are some of the dogs that he bred during that period, and also right up until he went back into the army in the 1940s. Now, I would also like to say that on the day that I was born, my father had bred a bulldog by the name of Millie. And Millie was born on the same day as me. Unfortunately, I don't have Millie's birth certificate handy, so I can't show you. But Millie grew up with me, grew up with my mother, grew up with my father, and during World War II, when my mother and myself went to Waltham Abbey, Millie was always a part of the family. Used to be out in the backyard doing the naughty things that it's not supposed to do in the backyard. And so every day my mum and myself would go in with a shovel and shove it all in the garden and so on. So, sorry, it was a bulldog.
Is it okay to ask questions during, or would you like
Yes,
to
no,
Yeah.
please ask questions
Yeah, I
now.
was going to ask about the dog, because I remember Granddad
Yeah.
always talked about bulldogs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, Millie was a bulldog,
Okay.
okay? So,
Jerry, who took the? When did your parents get married?
my parents got married round about 1934. So my dad left the army in 1930, and it turns out that one of the things my father was able to do was to drive a vehicle. And in those days, nobody had driving licenses. And so my father was always able to have work. He was always comparatively wealthy because, you know, he used to be able to drive all around London and all around there. And then round about 1934, he saw this lovely little chick in the road, and he stopped the vehicle and chatted her up. And that lovely little chick was about 10 or 15 years younger than me. Yeah, and she was the one that eventually became his wife. She absolutely worshipped him, and he worshipped her, and that was the way they were all of their lives. And so you might be interested to see.
Hey, and Jerry,
So-
Jerry, I'm sorry. Who took the photos?
My dad took them all.
Oh, he took them.
During the 19.
Okay.
So if you want to stick them down, you can look at them later. This was my mother at the beginning of World War II, and that adorable child with her was me. And I was just simply adorable. People used to love and worship me, but they also used to love and worship my mum a damn sight more. When it was found out that my mum's husband was in the war, it was amazing who used to try flirting with her. And so, that was the very first part of my wartime experience. The fact that my father was in World War II in North Africa. The second part of my experience was that my mother and myself were living on our own in England. Yeah.
What? What do you get from the Americans?
Sorry?
What he got from the Americans in his truck.
So they're similar, yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I'll do that when I'm talking about what he did.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
But we gone past it.
So the second
I know her.
tremendous influence in my life was the fact that my mother and myself lived on our own. Now, the third part is Waltham Abbey. So you might want to take a look at the maps.
And out of those paper maps that
Yes.
people send
Yeah, they're the paper maps that you've got. Now, Waltham Abbey is a suburb of London. It's North London. You know, I'll just sort of walk around and just point to a few things that, so you can see. You will see that Waltham Abbey is sort of roundabout in that area. And Enfield and this area, Chingford, were round about 15 miles away. And we had relatives that lived in both of those areas. And then we had this main road. You'll see that there's one here called Wake Arms, which actually went down into Waltham Abbey. Well, we lived at a house close on that road.
Was that 48?
Yeah, and that's 48 Honey Lane. Now, it turns out that my father had an elder brother, and 2 sisters. And his eldest sister, his sister Doris, was the oldest in the family. Then it came down to her brother Harry. Then it came down to my dad. And then the youngest one was somebody called Sybil. All right. My mother had 7 sisters. She had 2 brothers and herself. The eldest sister was somebody called Nell Underwood, who used to live very close to Enfield, which was about 14 or 15 miles away. And all of these relatives lived within this sort of radius. So all of them were accessible. Sorry? Yeah. So, roundabout in the early part of World War II, roundabout the late part of 1939, my mother's eldest sister, Nell Underwood, informed my mother that she had seen a place that was up for rent in a place called Waltham Abbey. And so my mum said, oh, lovely, because my mum was living with Nell at the time. And, you know, it turns out that they only had a small house, and that, you know, my mother and myself living in that house, we took up rather a lot of their space. Now also, Nell's husband, Ashley, was in the First World War, and he was a hero in the First World War. And they also had a younger son called Young Ashley. And so those 3, plus my mother and myself in the house, did make it a bit overcrowded. And to be quite honest, you know, they would have been very pleased to be able to get rid of my mum. So anyway, my mother and myself went to this house in a place called Honey Lane, which is round about here. And my mother and myself fell for the house immediately. It didn't have garage space, but it was on a main road. It had no garage space, but it did have a lovely front garden with a great big monkey tree. Do any of you know what a monkey tree is? Well, the monkey puzzle tree is a tree that is completely covered with spikes. So you may want to look it up sometime, a monkey tree in the front garden. It had a lovely back garden, and it had 3 bedrooms upstairs, a kitchen and a dining room downstairs, and then it had what was called a middle room, and it also had a front room, so it was actually quite a large house. So my mother and myself were able to afford the house because my father was getting paid because he was in the military, and plus the fact that he was in the military, they made it possible for my mother and myself to move into the house. So we moved into the house, and as you can see, she had this adorable little child called me. She was very, very good looking. We had a grocery store down at the bottom of the hill because we lived on the top of a hill at 48 Honey Lane. You will see that there is a recreation ground there, and when you walked out of the recreation ground and you went up the hill, we used to have to climb about 200 or 300 feet to get to the peak of the hill. And so when I was in my bedroom upstairs, I could look out over the recreation ground and see what was going on. Usually there were kids playing football and cricket and so on.
It's a nice house.
Yeah. Sorry? Yeah.
15%.
Now, Waltham Abbey itself was this church built round about roughly in around about 1066, and it is the place where King Harold was buried. And King Harold is the one that lost the battle of Hastings to France, and so this meant that the French took over England, and King Harold was killed. It's reported that he was killed by an arrow that went in his eye, and so he was buried in Waltham Abbey, and the arrow in his eye was part of his tombstone, and so the French were decent enough to let him be there. And I believe I don't think I've shown you pictures of the tombstone.
No, you haven't, not yet.
No, okay. I'm sorry, I don't have the pictures.
Yes, you do.
Oh, do I?
Yeah.
Oh yes. This is the picture of the tombstone where King Harold was buried. And my father's mother's ashes are buried round about 20 feet away from there. And the reason was my father was declared a hero of World War II. And so he was given a burial plot close to where King Harold was buried. I'll be talking about the rat's nest later, but so there is the picture of that.
May I interject just one thing on this? It was at the back of the church. Now it's in the middle of nowhere at the back of the church because Henry VIII, when he did the dissolution of all the Roman Catholic churches, destroyed it.
Yeah.
That guy.
Okay. And so it turns out that Mother and myself now lived in this place called Waltham Abbey. Unknown to us, there was a research and test station there called the Waltham Abbey, the ERDE, the Explosives Research and Development Establishment. If you look at your maps, you will see that the Explosives Research and Development Establishment is very, very close to the centre of town. Can you see that? It's mentioned here, and you will find that it's roundabout in this area. The Explosives Research and Development Establishment, all right? Now, it turns out that the Explosives Research and Development Establishment was set up in the 17th century so that the nobility could have a complete supply of gunpowder and explosives in case the peasants gave them a problem. And it was arranged that all of the stuff that with the research that was done there and all of the materials that were made could then be transferred to the Tower of London. And it was arranged, you will then look again, if you look at the map there, you will see there is something called the River Lee and the canal. And so in the 17th century, the British built a canal where they could load all of the explosives and research materials and have them transported to the Tower of London. So that is the history of why the Explosives Research and Department was there and what it was doing.
I didn't know it was that old. It's cool.
Yeah, so it was actually round about nearly 200 years old by the time World War II came around. Now, it turns out that throughout my whole scientific career, which as you know has extended from around about 1953 up until around about 2012 to 15, the influence of the ERDE remained with me the whole of the time. Every single place that I ever worked always got reports from what they were doing there, the things they were doing, and so on. Now, one of the things they were able to do was to measure the burning rates of cordite and explosive materials. And what they used to do, they used to be able to cut these materials into cubes, mount them on plasticine, put them inside a container, and put them inside something called the vented vessel. You might want to write the vented vessel down, because it's something you'll be able to look up. I don't have any pictures of it, but when you put these materials in the vented vessel, you could then set an explosion off. The materials would then burn, and then a lid would blow off and it would extinguish it. And so you would be able to measure how much of the cordite had burnt and so on, and also to be able to check the efficiency of the explosives. Now, it also turns out that all of these materials were also of interest if you were trying to modify the weather. Interested? Yeah.
I think they used it last week.
Yeah, you throw silver iodide into an explosive, throw it up in the air, and sure enough you can see clouds. And so they were interested in weather modification way before World War II. And as you know, weather modification is still one of the major activities of governments, research companies, and so on. And the other thing that was also examined in great detail was the chemistry of iron. Now, it turns out that iron is one of the most important elements in our own human system. It also turns out that iron and compounds of iron were also exceedingly useful for generating synthetic fuels. All of this was going on in the ERDE in the 1940s. And so the Germans and Hitler said, we've got to get that goddamn place. We've got to get it off the face of the earth. And so you will see, if you look at page 3 of your handout, up until 1943, they sent about 350 bombers, bombs and explosives that landed all around Waltham Abbey. And if you look at the very first map, you will see a load of dots on the very first map. And every single one of those dots represents where either a bomb landed or a German aircraft dropped a bomb. And even in those days, the Germans did have rockets. And that was up until 1943. And so that is the importance of all the things that was going on in the ERDE.
Did they ever hit? Bomb ever drop on ERDE?
Yes, but the ERDE actually covered a very large area of space around here, because they had rocket testing stations and they also had places where you had to be able to do your explosives. I mean, you know, when you wanted to use the vented vessel, you didn't do it in the office. You went to a remote laboratory somewhere where you were able to connect up an igniter that went to an explosive material, and then it would spark, and then it would, everything would all expand inside the vented vessel, and then the cover was then made to burn and then give away, and so the pressure suddenly dropped. So you had all the recordings of what the pressure was when it ignited and everything else. And so that was the reason why the Germans, Hitler and all of his staff wanted to get rid of Waltham Abbey, and that was the reason why every single dot that you see on the first map represents where the Germans either dropped a bomb or fired a rocket. Now that was up until 1943. Now, after 1943, the Germans got exceedingly clever, because after all, when you're at war with the world and you are as efficient and as clever as the Germans, you do all sorts of clever things, which I always admire so much. That's why I love them so much. The very first thing they did was to invent a plane that could just fly on its own. So it was very clever. They were able to control the plane, they filled it up with explosives and sent it over to England. And then when it got to wherever they wanted it, they would say to it, "Okay, buddy, now dive bomb and go and hit the target." Those beautiful little things were called doodlebugs. Have you ever heard of doodlebugs before? Write it down, because you're going to be able to look at it. Now, one of the beautiful things about doodlebugs for us poor slugs on the earth in Waltham Abbey was that you could hear them coming. And so it would be going, and it would take 2 or 3 minutes for it to land. You could hear it, and you had not the faintest idea where it was going to land.
That's psychological.
So you had the psychology, you had the brilliance of designing it, and so on. So we would get a call at school saying, "Oh blimey, quick, the bloody Germans are sending over a bunch of doodlebugs," and so on, see, because they could see them coming across the channel. So we would all build off into the air raid shelter in the playground, and we would carry on with our lessons in the playground. And then we would hear this plane outside, and then eventually it would land. Luckily, one of those bombs never ever landed on our air raid shelter. So, as you can see, for us kids at school, it was all yeah. Remember the old Jerry's there? Because for us it all used to be a big laugh and a joke. Then the next even more wonderful thing that the Germans invented was something called the V2 rocket. The V2 rocket was full of explosives. It could be guided from Germany, and it could be guided to wherever they wanted it to land. And if you look at the second one, the second map, take a look at it, you will see where all the V2s and the doodlebugs landed in Waltham Abbey. That's on the second map. All right, that's this one. So every single one of these triangles and circles is where either a V2 landed or a doodlebug. And of course, the wonderful thing about the V2s is you never even knew they were coming. So, for example, my friend Jimmy Strudwick, who used to live in the road that led into the ERDE, was out playing in the middle of the road and a V2 landed on his head. When they dug the crater out, they found Jimmy's remains, and they know that it landed on his head. And that was round about 200 or 300 yards from the entrance to the ERDE. So we had the joys of the doodlebugs, the V2 rockets, and also the German planes bombing us the whole time.
So, Jerry, from your house to these disasters of the bombs, how far was it?
I used to live, as I say, on the top of the hill in Honey Lane. So I used to be able to go down round about a quarter of a mile to a pub called the Green Man. Then I used to be able to take a road that took me into Waltham Abbey that was round about 1.5 miles long. And then once I was in Waltham Abbey, I was able to just go to school immediately, because my school was in a place called Quaker Lane. If you look, you can even see Quaker Lane on that map.
But crow flies from
So
where
as
you...
crow flies, it was round about 1.5 miles, 2 miles from both the centre of town and where the entrance to the ERDE was.
No. From your house to the closest bomb,
Okay.
how close?
The closest bomb landed on my friend's house at the bottom of the hill, the Westerns. It turns out that my two friends, the two brothers weren't in the house, nor was the mother, and the father was in the fighting in the army. And so that house got flattened by, I can't remember now whether it was a bomb or I believe it was a doodlebug.
But your house to the closest bomb was how close?
Round about 150 yards. So that's the story of Waltham Abbey, and that's what it's all about. Okay? So, I've told you about my mother's existence and my existence, and I've told you about my dad being in North Africa. My dad, yes.
Did you have an opportunity to be evacuated?
Oh yes, we did have a thing called evacuation, where you could be sent to a place in England that was safer. Both my mother and myself decided that we wanted to stay together, and so we weren't evacuated. Now I would like to add at this time that Margaret used to live round about 15 miles away. It's some place called over here somewhere, around this area here. And she did not get all the bombs that we got in Waltham Abbey, but behind her house was an airfield. And that airfield was used by the British Air Force. And so it did get bombed. And so Margaret used to look out of her back garden into a field like this that was an airfield. And I have been back there since, Margaret has been back since, and one of Margaret's oldest friends used to live in the same road, and that woman still lives there. but the whole road has now been taken over by immigrants. And so that woman still lives in the same house, but she is now surrounded by immigrants into England, who all emigrated to England during the end of the World War II, and also during some of the upheavals that they've been in the war since. So, what was it like living in England? One of the things we used to have were things called boarders. And because we had a large house, and because we had 3 bedrooms, it was expected that the people that used to get drafted to go and work at the ERDE had to have somewhere to live. And so we were asked on several occasions if those people could come and live with us. And so one of the ladies that came to live with us was a lady called Betty Hesler. And as you can see, she was the very, very first woman that I ever fell in love with.
Not Margaret.
No. Betty Hesler was the very first one that I ever fell in love with. And her husband used to work at the ERDE. I do not have the faintest idea what he was doing. And come to that, I never ever did find out what Betty used to do, because Betty used to work there as well. But they never ever discussed what they were doing. And so there is Betty again, and that naughty husband of hers did something to her, and she ended up having a baby.
So they all live with you?
Yeah. And so there's a picture of Betty and her husband at the back there. And it turns out that her husband also, in the end, went over to the Far East. And we never ever did discover where he was going or what he was doing. But he did come back. So there is Betty and her husband with my mother and so on. And so, to continue the story. In 1944, a doctor joined my father's unit in Cairo and did a routine medical examination on my dad. And he looked at my father and he said, "Excuse me, sir, did you know that you have cancer on the throat?" So my dad said, "What?" I get a little bit husky every now and again, but what they do is they clip it off and then I'm all right again for a few months. He said, "Well, that thing that they're clipping off is a cancerous growth. You are now demobbed from the army instantly." And so the afternoon where it was defined that my father had cancer, he was demobbed from the army. And you will see there are his demob papers.
What does demob mean?
They're kicked out of the
Kicked out of the army.
Demobilized or something?
Yeah. Detention, whatever.
And so there he was. So it took him nearly 2-3 weeks to be able to catch a boat to come back to England. And during that that time, he had everything that he'd saved from me stolen. And so much of what my father had saved and was going to bring back from me and my mother got stolen. And the very, very last thing that he said to me when he died was, "Son, I am so sorry that I lost my kit bag. That was the very, very last thing he ever said to me. And I said, Dad, all I wanted was to have you back with Mum.
Right.
I wanted to see you kissing and cuddling every night, and I wanted you to tell me everything. Well, I'm really sorry, son. And apparently in that kit bag, he had German helmets and all sorts of stuff. So, when my father was in the desert, he was in a place called El Alamein, where there were a load of Italians and also Germans fighting.
Wait. Those rowdy kids.
Pile about 6 of them.
That's a motorcycle riffraff.
And so, my dad's 8th Army boys eventually captured what they called a rat's nest. And the rat's nest was where the Germans and the Italians had machine guns and guns that they used to fire at the British troops. All right? Well, my dad and his buddies captured one of these and then proceeded to confiscate everything that was in the rat's nest. Let me show you a few of the things that they found. Okay. These were taken from the rat's nest. These were German objects. A German belt buckle and a German helmet and also a German memento. And this was the memento of my father's from the 8th Army.
I think your dad and me probably past time, because I think my dad was part of the 8th Army.
Yeah, it would never surprise me. Another thing that my dad was able to steal from there was this copy of German propaganda, talking about how well the Germans were doing and how they were just beating the crap out of the English.
Should have dedicated you.
My dad's stuff together in 4 albums. We donated that or to museums.
Yeah.
And my dad,
I think it's
Now,
pretty cool.
the other thing is that
Yeah.
during World War II, there were
Yeah.
2 forms of air raid shelters that made it safe for the civilians. One of them was the Anderson shelter, which was a hole dug in the ground in your garden with curved steel over the top that was then covered with earth. And so every night, my mother and myself used to go to the Anderson shelter to go to sleep. So we used to sleep in the garden inside a hole that was covered with concrete and soil. That was an Anderson shelter. During the end of the war, there was also something called a Morrison shelter that was made by the British that had a solid steel top and was mounted with steel girders, and you used to be able to have that inside so that if the building collapsed it would fall onto the shelter but you would still be safe. And so we had one of those in our front yard, and that's where my father used to do all his work when he was working there. When my father had his first operation from Dr. Keogh, I've already mentioned this, haven't I? He was then sent to a hospital in Middlesex which was one of the palaces of the king and queen. And there he learnt skills about how to do leather work. And this is an example of one of the pieces of leather work that my father made. There's something called thonging on there. And these are the tools that my father was provided with. One of them is for making the holes for the thonging, and the other one is for doing stitching. And he was provided with those at the place where he was taught a skill. And so when my father got out of hospital, it turns out that because he was one of the few people that could drive, he found a job easily. And he was a qualified surveyor anyway. And so with his skills at driving and also knowing where he was in London, he always had jobs. And so, and in those days, he, of course, didn't have computers to work out where he was or what the degrees were he had to run. He had to use a logbook, which he used for computing the angles he had to drive to and all that stuff. That's a logbook.
So that's literally like logarithm.
Yeah.
Right. And we were discussing, how you in the early days.
Before my father left, you can see the 8th Army. They were the boys with their gun, and they are the ones that beat the crap out of them. The 8th Army.
Crap out of the crowds.
How old were you when your father passed?
When my father died,
Yeah.
my father died in 1981, 82. So yeah. And again, my father, with the truck he used to drive all the way along North Africa. Now my father also recorded everything between Cairo and El Alamein, because it used to be about a 1,000-mile drive, and my father did do detailed recordings and notes on everything that was on that road.
So Jerry, one of the interesting things to me would be my father, when he died, got a medal for North Africa.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to know if your father and my father ever crossed.
Yes, well, it can be traced. Now, one or two of the other things that I want to show you.
Jared,
Well,
tell them that story about your dad driving in North Africa
yeah.
before you go into that.
When my father used to drive in North Africa,
Tripoli.
and one of the things he used to do was to run a crown and anchor board when he was in Cairo. And he used to be very, very good, because when you ran your own crown and anchor board,
But we don't understand
Yeah.
what that is.
it's a game.
Gambling.
And when you and the person that's running the board always wins. So my father got an absolute fortune, and he used to roll all the money up in Andrew's liver salts and send them to my mother.
He would rock.
It's like a crown and anchor board. You have like 8 players.
Yeah.
2 people win, but 6 people lose.
But how did he get the money to England? I didn't
Well,
understand.
he like shipped it or something.
It was the Andrews all sorts containers. and his liver salts is a can of stuff, and he that helps you go to the bathroom.
I missed that one.
And
Oh.
and he used to send the money back in the can. And the first time, his mum wondered what the heck she was getting this for.
So, yes. No, it was that we used to get the Oh yeah. And one of the things my dad used to be able to get from the Americans was he used to be able to purchase razor blades because the British troops didn't have razor blades.
Right.
And so then my father was able to distribute the razor blades to all the 8th Army, which he had got from the Americans. And the Americans were very generous. This is a picture of me during World War II and a letter that I wrote to my dad.
Aww, military.
And when my dad came home, something strange happened. I had a brother.
Came along and ruined everything.
Yeah. And during World War II, my friend next door, the Walkers, we used to share a fence. And so that's my friend Bill Walker, and that's me. And I still have correspondence with Bill Walker to this very day. Because Bill is my age. Now the other thing I also need to say is that when we lived in 48 Honey Lane, our very first next door neighbours was somebody called the Jarmans. And the Jarmans, Frank Jarman was a policeman. And so this meant that he was able to look after all of our interests as far as safety and all that stuff. They eventually moved to a place behind us. We kept a friend with the Jarmans forever. And the Jarmans also had a very gorgeous daughter called Joyce, who was the second one that I ever fell in love with. But she was a little bit old for me. And
Action.
again, these are other pictures of what took place. And then we also had another neighbour called the Tuttons, who lived just down the road from us. They were also the police. They also had 3 gorgeous daughters, who I also fell in love with.
Is that 3, 4, and 5?
Yeah. Now, one other little thing that Margaret's reminded me about was my mother and Bet. We used to have a place down the bottom of the hill that was a grocery store, and it used to be run by a place called Mr. Lloyd. So my mother and Betty Heslop used to go down there, and by flirting with Mr. Lloyd, they were always able to get extra food. And of course there was always extra food around because we were completely surrounded by farms and nurseries. If you look at the maps, all of this area was all farmland and forest. Sorry? Sorry? Yeah, and at one time there were also German prisoners of war, and the German prisoners of war were situated round about this area, around here. And it turns out that one of the Germans prisoners of war used to be a very well-known boxer, and he used to come to our youth club and he used to teach me how to box. He was known as Herman the German.
Herman the German.
And so, one of the things that my dad used to do on the Morrison shelter, I used to collect pictures of boxers. And my dad used to stick all of that into that album for me.
Wow, yeah, that's really something. That is really cool.
He used to do it on the top of the Morrison shelter, and he used to heat his glue there. And you will see all of the boxes, and he helped me mount all of those. And if you look, you will see a load of the boxers there that were famous at the time.
And afterwards.
and afterwards. And Henry Armstrong there was in fact the world champion of
Jack
three.
Phillips is in there.
He held 3 world championships.
Yeah, that's it.
And so, after World War II, my parents, who were so generous and so kind to me, they used to buy me little presents. And this was the very, very first alarm clock they ever bought me. Apparently it still works. This is the diary of the ARP warden from Waltham Abbey. You'll see that I got the 2 maps from there, and then inside you'll see all the pictures of the bombed houses.
You know, the one thing you haven't told me is the other most important thing about Waltham Abbey, the Abbey itself.
Oh yeah, well, one of the important things that happened at Waltham Abbey was that in 1960, Margaret and myself got married there.
Ah, that's the most important. Who cares about the rest?
30 years later, we went back there and they remarried us.
Oh.
And all of my friends went to the wedding, and a load of my friends from school all came during our 30th wedding anniversary.
Wow.
40th. So some of the things that I then did, when I was at the Waltham Abbey School, I learned how to do woodwork, and that was a mirror frame that I made. As you will see, the mortise and tenon joints were very spectacular.
But I think the person in the mirror
The highest of quality.
is beyond beautiful.
Yeah,
I don't know how you did the mirror, so she's beyond beautiful, and I'm beyond beautiful, and maybe even you, when you look in the mirror, are beyond beautiful.
I'll try not to look into it. I might break it.
No, you won't. You'll be
my parents,
than you've ever been.
my parents also bought me the most up-to-date bike at the time, called the Rally Clubman, which I still have in the garage. It weighed 22 pounds. This is pictures of me riding and racing on the Rally Club.
Is that the black one?
No, the blue one. It's still got the original finish. And it's in the
Guess what,
garage
I-
still. There's 2 lots. And one of the things that I did up until the 1940s was I was in the Boy Scouts when I made friends with a great friend of mine called Jack Chapman. We are still friends, we still write to each other, and we went on a tour to Bayeux in 1952. These are the pictures we took. I went on the Rally Clubman and he went on his doors.
Where's Bayeux?
France. Bayeux. Bayeux in France, where the tapestry is.
The tapestries.
And one of the other things that I also did when I was started to go to college, I also learnt to play the clarinet, and this is a picture of me playing in the band.
Ah, and I think this man plays the clarinet, and I think your granddaughter
Yeah.
and your
And this, the musical thing in my family has been transferred to at least 3 of my children,
It's heavy.
and also my granddaughters.
yes.
I have 5 granddaughters, and of course they also get this musical ability from Margaret, because Margaret has the most beautiful singing voice that you have ever heard in your life.
And I'm
And
not genetically related. I
No.
cannot sing. I cannot dance. I can't play a musical instrument, but I'm a great audience. I will pay the dollars to sit in
Yeah.
a chair to listen to Paula.
And I have to say that I wish she was still here, that Margaret has always been the perfect companion to me. She was always slim,
I lost it.
she's always kind to me, she always looks after me, and she is so talented. You'll see that a number of the pictures around the wall are what she learned and what she did by painting. And she is
She
a
can
beautiful
sing.
singer, and she's also, very beautiful and very kind.
She can dance,
She
and
can
she
dance.
loves you.
Yeah.
He puts up with all of your
Yeah.
stuff there, Jerry.
Great, you missed the best part. He was just talking you up.
Yeah, I'm talking about you. How you can sing,
How you
dance,
his companion.
music.
Remains here.
One of the things, because my father was able to drive and he knew his way around London, it also meant that for many years, he used to go to help clean up all the bomb damage. And one of the things that he learned was a friend of his who did woodwork and who made me that money box.
That's cute.
But it also ended up that I worked at the ERDE myself from 1953 to 55, and then my father then went and worked there until he retired.
Hey, mate, there's a bit of Dutch in there.
Yeah,
I've got money.
and that's the start of my memoirs.
Hey,
And so I
Jared.
end up, I thank you all so much for
No, no,
coming.
no.
Norma has a question.
Oh,
You have a question, Norma?
Nice go, Jason. Really rich money.
I'm sorry, say again. Oh,
ERDE,
Elex-
Explosives Research and Development Establishment.
I love that. Josh, you start.
the establishment.
The other thing that I found, I'm going to just say one thing, is when you mentioned the town of Enfield, that is actually where the Enfield rifles were developed. And
Oh yeah,
and I didn't,
yeah.
I didn't know that at the time. It was
see that.
only when I came over here and saw Enfield rifles that
I didn't see
And
your
so
name
there
on the
was
front.
an
Gerald.
NPR thing about two
Very
Someone
cool.
made it for
about
me.
these
Yeah,
rifles
right.
and where they came
Well, yeah,
from.
one of my dad's buddies.
And I
Yeah.
never knew that they came from England and what they were used for.
Yeah, hello,
From
goodbye
all
Jeff
the
and Norma, and I hope you
battles.
enjoyed the trip, the talk. Bye bye.
Enjoy.
Sorry you weren't here. Bye bye.
So, Dad, I did not know that Granddad
Dad.
was,
Okay.
was a war hero in the
Bye.
eyes of the nation.
Oh yes,
Bye,
I did
Jeff.
not know that.
yeah.
You know, some of your grandparents were, I'm gonna call them hoteliers and,
Good job, Jerry.
and bed breakfast, but they didn't call them that.
Yeah.
And I'm just reading it.
Thank you so much. And I owe all of
Awesome.
my
But
luck in life to the loving support and so on of my wonderful wife and family.
And also,
Yeah.
Dad, so when Granddad drove a milk truck, was it a milk truck or a
Yes.
milk wagon with a horse?
No, he used both, and he did all that before World War
Oh, yep.
II.
Moulin Rouge.
Yeah, and I've got copies of certificates he won and things like that. Yeah, yeah. My dad worked as a milk roundsman before World War II.
I gotta tell you, I have, you know me, I've got tons of great memories of your dad.
Yeah,
I mean, of your whole family.
yeah,
But your dad in particular,
yeah,
you know, who taught us Scrabble,
yeah,
taught me how to drink beer,
yeah. No, he was a marvelous man.
Schlitz 45s.
And so
And
was
two
my mother.
zigzags.
Yeah.
My mother was an absolute
Okay,
sweetheart.
that's all we need.
The only thing I want to add to that from my perspective, because I'm 2 years younger than Jerry, my memories, of course, of the war are a little less than his. But first of all, we used to hide under the stairs. We had, which they do for the hurricanes and things. And then we had the Morrison and the other shelter. But I used to go out, my biggest thing during the war was going out every morning, going down the garden looking for shrapnel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Excuse me before you start. Anybody want coffee or tea or anything?
I'll take a cupper.
thank
Yeah,
you, Jerry.
I
That
wouldn't
was
mind
very
another cup.
Thank you,
simple.
yeah, that was really great.
My father
Hang on, I
died.
didn't hear from these people. Hold on. Do you want, are you go for wine or do you want any coffee or tea or
I
anything?
think we're good.
Okay.
So Mom, did you guys look for shrapnel because you could recycle it? And get
No, we used to keep it. I do have shrapnel in my upstairs.
Yeah.
As I told you, there was so many things that I still did not get ready for this talk. But I do have collections of shrapnel.
Yeah, well, very cool.
So,
Well, Dad, there's a lot of things in there I didn't know. So that
Yeah.
was very, very cool.
Yeah, and of course my father was a qualified surveyor,
Yeah.
and so the fact that he could drive and survey, and then in 1950 something or other, he went down to the ERDE, and my boss, a guy called Dr. Hodge, said, "Are you any relative to Gerald Ansell?" He said, "Yeah, I'm his father. You're hired." And so my father ended up working at the ERDE.
So I got a question. So at the bottom of the hill, there was a park called the Rec.
Yeah.
Was that called the Rec as in recreation?
No.
Or Rec
recreation.
as in that's
No,
where the bombs went
recreation.
off?
And there was an air raid shelter that was built there. And the Westerns used to live opposite me.
I remember Nanny used to send me down
Taking
to
them.
the store to buy things.